Sareth Kal Devrin felt the silence settle through the bridge of the unyielding vow like a predator's weight pressing down on a kill. 3 ships gone. Corvettes of the 3rd Screening Wing, 93 crew, obliterated in 43 seconds by something his sensors could not find, his weapons could not track, and his 4,000 years of inherited tactical doctrine could not classify. The wreckage expanded across the void between his fleet and the alien vessel, a small diplomatic frigate, unarmed, 43 crew of its own, and the red light of the system's dwarf star caught each tumbling fragment and scattered it into brief, sharp flashes that his predator-evolved eyes tracked automatically, the way they tracked any movement in the killing field. His crest, the ridge of stiffened cartilage running from skull crown to the base of his neck, stood at full height, dominance posture, involuntary, his body asserting what his mind could not process, that the Praetori Ascendancy's crescent of judgment, 47 capital warships arranged in the formation that had made 11 species defer without a shot fired, had just been answered by something that should not exist. A weapon that struck from nowhere and vanished into nothing. Around him, his bridge crew maintained their stations with the rigid discipline of hunters who had heard the wrong sound in the grass. Commander Voreth at tactical, her claws locked around the weapon's console, every muscle in her forearms straining against the impulse to fire at a target that was not there. Lieutenant Kale at sensors, his amber eyes cycling through spectra with the frantic precision of a tracker who had lost the scent. Navigation Officer Drain, motionless, staring at the void as though waiting for it to produce an explanation. And beneath all of it, beneath the bridge sounds, the hum of the reactor, the click of claws on control surfaces, the subsonics. Sareth could feel them. Every Praetori could. The subsonic register operated below conscious control, a continuous low-frequency broadcast produced by every individual, modulated by physiological state, carrying the true emotional condition of the speaker to every other Praetori within range. You could not silence it. You could not fake it. It was the channel that could not lie. His bridge crew was broadcasting fear. Not the focused fear of combat, the sharp spike that sharpened reflexes and narrowed attention. This was structural fear, the deep, destabilizing frequency that a Praetori produced when something violated the architecture of how the universe was supposed to work. Sareth had heard it once before, decades ago, when a deep-range patrol had discovered that an entire star system previously mapped as stable had simply ceased to exist, collapsed into gravitational anomaly, every planet, every station, every outpost gone, with no explanation that any instrument could provide. That same frequency filled his bridge now. His crew did not understand what had happened. Neither did Sareth, and his subsonics were telling every Praetori on every ship in the formation exactly that. The tactical implications alone would have been enough to destabilize his processing. The Praetori Ascendancy's military doctrine rested on a single axiom that had held for millennia, that the crescent of judgment represented the apex of deployable force within charted space. 47 capital warships, each one carrying enough kinetic and directed energy weaponry to sterilize a continental surface. The formation had ended conflicts before they began. It had made 11 species reconsider hostility in the time it took light to cross the distance between fleets. And something had reached into the heart of that formation, struck 3 vessels and vanished before the crescent could orient, not crippled them, not damaged them, annihilated them. With 3 volleys that Sareth's weapons officers were now describing as impossibly precise, each impact targeting the structural junction between the corvette's reactor housings and their hull frames, the single point of maximum catastrophic failure. Whoever had fired those volleys had known Praetori ship architecture, had known where to hit, had aimed not to fight but to demonstrate with surgical economy that fighting was unnecessary. That precision frightened Sareth more than the invisibility. An invisible weapon was a tactical problem, solvable, given time and analysis. A weapon that understood Praetori engineering well enough to destroy 3 ships with 3 shots, each one placed at the exact point of maximum structural failure, suggested something worse than technological superiority. It suggested study. Years of it. A species that had examined the Praetori from a distance, mapped their vulnerabilities, and prepared countermeasures before the first word of greeting was exchanged. The Praetori had believed they were the ones watching. The pre-contact intelligence assessment had described the Terrans as recently detected, a young spacefaring civilization whose signal emissions had been identified 7 standard years ago. The assessment had implied, without stating explicitly, that the Praetori held the advantage of prior knowledge. Sarath was beginning to suspect that the opposite was true. He silenced his crest's involuntary rise with an effort of will that would have impressed his combat instructors at the War College, reached for the command tongue, the guttural, percussive register of authority that his military caste used to impose order on chaos. Vorath, status of the alien frigate. Unchanged, High Commander. Her voice was steady, but her subsonics were not. The vessel has not altered position, powered weapons, or raised shields. It reads as completely unarmed. 43 crew, biological, confirmed warm-blooded, carbon-based, single respiratory system species. No military capability detected. And the weapon that destroyed 3 of my corvettes. Gone, High Commander. Every sensor sweep returns empty. Gravimetric, thermal, electromagnetic, tachyonic, all negative. Whatever fired those volleys is no longer present in any detection range we possess. Or, she hesitated. Or it is present and we cannot detect it. Yes, High Commander. Sarath let that settle through him. A weapon that his fleet could not see, could not track, and could not engage. A weapon deployed alongside a diplomatic vessel that carried no weapons of its own. The force composition made no tactical sense by Praetori doctrine. The Ascendancy would never deploy an unarmed vessel into a first contact scenario. Vulnerability invited exploitation, and exploitation invited conflict. Every Praetori ship carried weapons because every Praetori understood that the universe sorted its inhabitants into those who could defend themselves and those who could not, and the sorting was final. These Terrans had sent both, an unarmed vessel carrying a diplomat who wanted to talk, and an invisible warship carrying weapons that could kill before the talk began. 2 strategies, 2 doctrines, 2 answers to the same question: how do you meet the unknown? Occupying the same space simultaneously, apparently without resolving the contradiction. The Praetori achieved unity through subsonic consensus. These Terrans, it appeared, did not achieve unity at all. They carried their disagreements to the negotiating table the way a hunter carried unhealed wounds into the field, present, painful, and visible to anyone who knew how to look. A weapon that had answered the crescent of judgment. The ritualized dominance display that 11 species across 4,000 years had understood and deferred to, with 43 seconds of precisely targeted violence, and then disappeared. He had sent the corvettes himself. The order was standard, the 3rd screening wing crossing the established perimeter as a dominance display, a formalized assertion of Praetori military confidence intended to establish hierarchy before negotiations began. Theater. Every species understood it. The correct response was deference, acknowledgement, accommodation. The corvettes crossed, the newcomers yielded, and negotiations proceeded from a position of acknowledged Praetori superiority. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked, 11 times in 4,000 years. Until today. Kale, what do we know about this species? The sensor officer's claws tapped rapidly across his console, pulling up the pre-contact intelligence file. Species designation: Terran. Homeworld: 3rd planet of a G-type main sequence star, approximately 400 light-years spinward. First detected 7 standard years ago through anomalous signal emissions in their local space. Intelligence assessment classified them as a young spacefaring civilization, pre-expansion phase, estimated technological development 2 to 3 centuries behind ascendancy baseline. 2 to 3 centuries behind. Yes, High Commander. Sarath stared at the debris field. 93 of his crew, killed by a species his intelligence division had classified as technologically inferior. The pre-contact assessment had described the Terrans as an emerging power, worth monitoring, worth contacting, potentially worth incorporating into the ascendancy sphere of influence through the standard diplomatic mechanisms that had brought 11 other species into varying degrees of cooperation. The assessment had not mentioned invisible warships. Put me through to the alien vessel. The main display shifted. The image resolved into a chamber smaller than Sarath's ready room, lit at a frequency uncomfortable for Praetori eyes, a warm amber spectrum tuned to a different visual range. Standing at the center was a being. Small, absurdly small by Praetori standards, barely half his height, with a frame that looked as though a casual blow from a Praetori hunting arm would shatter it. Soft-skinned, without hide or armor plating, the face dominated by 2 forward-facing eyes with circular pupils that did not expand or contract with emotional state the way Praetori eyes did. A species with no visible biological weaponry. No claws, no armor, no venom glands, no electroreceptors. Physically, by every metric the Praetori used to assess threat potential, negligible. And yet this species had just destroyed 3 of his warships in 43 seconds, with a weapon he could not find. I am High Commander Sarath Kal Davrin of the Praetori Ascendancy. He spoke in the command tongue, hard and clipped. 3 of my ships have been destroyed. My sensors detected no attacker. My weapons acquired no target. My tactical systems registered no threat signature before, during, or after the destruction. I will have an explanation. The small being's expression did not change. No flinch, no deference, no accommodation. She looked at him with those strange circular pupils and opened her mouth, and what came out was not the translation-mediated speech he had expected. She spoke the diplomatic register. Sarath's pupils contracted to slits before he could control the reaction. The diplomatic register, the whistled tonal mode produced by the secondary respiratory system, the private language of Praetori diplomatic exchange, never shared with outsiders, never taught to alien species. 11 contacts, and not one had learned to speak it. Not one had tried. This being, this small, fragile, clawless creature from a world 2 to 3 centuries behind the ascendancy, was speaking his language. Not the command tongue that every species heard because it was the face the Praetori chose to show. The other one. The one that carried emotional weight. The one that required a secondary respiratory system the Terrans did not possess. Her pronunciation was imperfect. The frequencies wavered at the edges, shaped by a vocal apparatus clearly not designed for the purpose, produced through techniques Sarath could not identify, controlled exhalations shaped by tongue and lip configurations that forced an alien throat to approximate sounds it was never meant to make. But the structure was correct. The grammar was correct. The tonal patterns fell within the tolerance range that marked the difference between incomprehensible and accented. She was speaking to him the way a Praetori spoke to a Praetori. The implications cascaded through his assessment protocols faster than he could organize them. The diplomatic register was not something that could be learned from recordings alone. The tonal precision required real-time feedback, the kind of iterative refinement that only came from sustained, intensive practice with a native speaker or an extraordinarily sophisticated acoustic model. The Terrans had no native speakers. They had never contacted the Praetori. They had built this capability, this fluency in his people's private language, from intercepted transmissions alone. Which meant they had been listening for years. Listening with instruments sensitive enough to capture the diplomatic register's frequency range across interstellar distances. listening with analytical frameworks sophisticated enough to decode tonal grammar from fragmentary intercepts. Listening with the patience and the obsession of a species that understood, somehow, that the command tongue was not the whole story. They had heard the Praetori the way the Praetori had never been heard, and they had spent years, 9 years, she had said, preparing to speak back on the channel that mattered. The destruction of your vessels was not ordered by my authority, she said. The whistled tones carried the diplomatic register's inherent emotional texture, sincerity, formality, respect. Whether she understood the emotional layer she was broadcasting or was simply reproducing sounds, Sereth could not determine. It was the action of a Terran military asset operating under rules of engagement that were not coordinated with my diplomatic mission. I did not know the asset was present. Its action does not represent the Terran Conquered's intentions for this first contact. The bridge had gone silent, not the operational silence of a functioning warship, the absolute silence of an entire crew staring at a display showing something none of their training had prepared them for. An alien speaking the private register, on the first contact, without being taught. Sereth felt his subsonic shift into a pattern he did not recognize in himself, a deep, complex frequency at the intersection of territorial dissonance, and something he could not name. His body was telling him that the universe had just reorganized itself, and his conscious mind had not caught up. You are telling me that your own military acted without your knowledge or authorization. I am. And that the weapon that destroyed 3 warships in 43 seconds, then vanished without trace, is not under your control. It is under Terran military control. It is not under my control. That distinction is not reassuring. No, it is not. It was not meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be honest. Honest? Sereth turned the word over in his mind, testing it against everything he knew about first contacts. 11 species, 11 sets of negotiations. Every one of them had begun with deference. The newcomer accommodating Praetori dominance, telling the Praetori what they wanted to hear, establishing a framework of cooperation built on the implicit acknowledgement that the Praetori were stronger. This one was telling him that her own species had acted against her wishes, that the weapon was beyond her authority, and that the situation was as dangerous and incomprehensible to her as it was to him. No species had ever opened a first contact with that kind of admission. It was, by every diplomatic standard Sereth had been trained in, a catastrophic tactical error, revealing internal division to a potential adversary, confessing weakness in the opening exchange, surrendering the high ground before the first term was discussed. Unless it was not an error at all, unless it was something else entirely. Sereth shifted from combat posture to assessment posture, leaning back in his command chair, lowering the tension in his hunting musculature, letting his body communicate what the command tongue could not. I am thinking. His scarred left flank caught the blue-white bridge light, and he was aware of the Terran's eyes tracking the scar tissue, reading him, the way he read others. He switched to the diplomatic register for the first time, a concession, a choice to meet her on the channel she had chosen. Your pronunciation, he said, and felt his subsonics produce a frequency he had to examine before he could classify it. Interest, not the predatory kind. The rarer variant, the resonance of a mind encountering something that did not fit into its existing categories. You are speaking the diplomatic register, not the command tongue. You chose. I did. Why? Because the command tongue is for issuing orders, and I am not here to issue orders. The diplomatic register is for building understanding across difference. That is what I am here for. No species has ever spoken the diplomatic register to us. It is considered our internal mode. Private. The 11 species we have contacted previously communicated through translation systems operating in the command tongue. They spoke to our military face because that was the face we showed. You showed the military face because it was the safe face, the Terran said. The face that could not be hurt. The diplomatic register requires vulnerability. It uses the secondary respiratory system, which is physiologically linked to emotional processing. Speaking the diplomatic register to a stranger means exposing the channel that carries your actual feelings about the conversation. The command tongue carries no such risk. His pupils narrowed, then dilated. The sequence that every Praetori recognized as the involuntary response to being accurately read by someone who should not have possessed the ability. His subsonics flared, defensive surprise, chased immediately by reluctant respect, the patterns layering over each other in a way that his bridge crew could certainly read if they were listening. They were listening, every one of them. You know our physiology. I have spent 9 years studying your physiology, your language, your social structure, your military organization, your subsonic register, and your naming conventions. I know that calling your name designates the senior lineage of the Davren clan. I know that High Commander is the 4th highest rank in the Praetori military hierarchy, and that you achieved it 7 standard years ago after the contested frontier campaign. I know that your scar pattern indicates at least 3 separate engagements in which you sustained kinetic impacts to the left thoracic plate and survived through what your medical corps calls controlled regeneration. She paused. The silence had weight. I did not learn these things because the conquered ordered me to. I learned them because I wanted to understand who I was going to talk to, not what, who. And the difference between those two questions is, I believe, the difference between the 11 contacts you describe as hollow and the conversation we are having now. Sarath held still for 8 seconds, an eternity in Praetori interaction, where dominance was typically established in fractions of a second. His subsonics cycled through patterns he could feel but could not control: assessment, surprise, and something unfamiliar. A frequency he had never produced before, like a door in a wall he had not known existed, swinging open. You came here, he said, knowing who I am. Yes. Not what I command, who I am. Yes. No one has done that, in 11 contacts. In 4,000 years. No one was listening on the right channel, the Terran said. I was. The words entered Sarath's processing like a blade finding the gap between armor plates. Clean, precise, aimed at the one place where the Praetori had no defense because they had never needed one. He thought about the debriefings after each previous contact. The formal assessments, filed in the Ascendancy's diplomatic archives, that classified every first contact as a success. Trade routes established. Resource agreements signed. Military threat profiles updated, the institutional machinery of the Ascendancy processing each contact with the efficiency of a species that had been doing this for 4 millennia. And he thought about the silence that followed each debriefing. The walk back to his quarters through corridors where every crew member he passed broadcast the same low, unacknowledged frequency. The hours lying in darkness, listening to his own subsonics, produced the pattern his training told him to classify as post-operational fatigue, and his body told him was something else entirely. The Terran had just given it a name. She had called it fear. She had called it loneliness. She had reached across 400 light-years and found the frequency that the Praetori had been broadcasting for millennia without recognizing what it was, and she had said it out loud, in his own language, on his own channel. The place where a species that broadcast its internal state involuntarily encountered a species that had voluntarily learned to listen. Sarath had commanded warships for 31 standard years. He had participated in 6 first contacts, 4 as a junior officer, 2 as the ranking commander. Everyone had followed the same pattern. The crescent of judgment deployed. The corvettes crossed the perimeter. The newcomer deferred. Negotiations proceeded. Agreements were reached. The newcomer departed. And everyone had left Sarath with the same residual frequency buried beneath his professional satisfaction. A low, persistent harmonic that he could not classify and did not discuss, because discussing involuntary subsonic emissions was considered a vulnerability that senior officers did not acknowledge. He had felt it after the Kelmery contact, his first as a junior tactical officer. The Kelmery had been a hive species, coordinated, efficient, their communication operating on chemical and pheromonal channels that were functionally invisible to Praetori senses. They had deferred instantly to the dominance display, signed a non-aggression pact within 6 hours, and departed. Textbook, successful by every objective metric. And Sarath had stood on the bridge afterward and felt something wrong. Not with the agreement, the terms were favorable. Not with the Kelmery, they were precisely what the intelligence assessment had predicted. Something wrong with the space between. The gap where a connection should have been and was not. The difference between speaking to a species and being heard by one. He remembered the Kelmery ambassador, a segmented being that communicated through chemical plumes released from glands along its thorax. It had deferred to the dominance display within seconds, its chemical output shifting to the appeasement spectrum before the corvettes had completed their crossing. The non-aggression pact was signed in 4 hours. The Kelmery departed with favorable trade terms and a navigation corridor through ascendancy space, and Sarath had stood on the bridge of his first command, a patrol cruiser, not a flagship, and watched the Kelmery vessel accelerate into the void, and felt the frequency begin. The Orhani had been different, a species of crystalline beings who processed light the way the Praetori processed sound, their emotional states expressed through shifts in optical refraction that made their bodies shimmer with meaning. Beautiful, alien in a way that excited Sarath's xenological curiosity, and they had deferred as quickly as the Kelmery. Faster, even their ambassador cycling through refraction patterns of submission before the formal greeting was complete, as though the dominance display had triggered an automatic response in their social architecture. 5 hours, trade agreement, navigation rights, departure, and the frequency afterward sitting in Sarath's subsonics like an old wound that refused to scar over. He had dismissed it again after the Orhani contact, and again after the Thessic contact, and again after the Veridani and the Gorath and every other species that had crossed the Ascendancy's path and responded to the command tongue with the command tongue, and left without ever hearing the register beneath. Until today. Until a species that had destroyed 3 of his corvettes without warning and then spoken to him in the language he used when no outsider was listening. Until a small, fragile being with no claws and no armor and no subsonic register had looked at him and said, "I wanted to understand who you are." And his biology, the channel that could not lie, had responded with a frequency he had spent 31 years pretending he did not produce. Longing. The subsonic pattern associated with an unmet need so fundamental that the body produced its signal continuously, below the threshold of conscious acknowledgement, until the mind learned to stop noticing it. The same frequency he detected in every Praetori he had ever served with, produced whenever the conversation turned to the void, the empty space beyond the Ascendancy's borders, the surveyed systems that contained resources and raw materials, and absolutely nothing that could speak back. The loneliness of a species that had conquered everything within reach and found, at every boundary, silence. Sarath had spent his career calling that frequency strategic awareness, the Ascendancy's vigilant monitoring of its perimeter for potential threats. His tactical training had classified it as defensive readiness. His institutional culture had given it a dozen professional names, all of which served the same function, disguising the truth that the Praetori's most decorated officers broadcast continuously. They were waiting. They were all waiting, and none of them had the vocabulary for what they were waiting for, because the thing they needed, another voice, had never arrived. Until now. The Terran diplomat, she had introduced herself as Envoy Cathara Vasan, A name Sereth had committed to memory with the automatic precision of a predator cataloging a new element in its environment, asked to explain her species. Not as a diplomatic preamble. Not as the curated self-presentation that every species delivered in first contacts. The polished version of its history, designed to project strength and minimize vulnerability. She asked to tell the truth. Sereth granted it because his subsonics were telling him something his training said he should not trust, that this being intended to be transparent. He could not hear her subsonics, she had none. Single respiratory species, one voice-producing organ, one channel, no involuntary broadcast, no biological guarantee of honesty. And yet his body, the register that could not lie, was responding to her as though she were producing consonants. As though her single channel was somehow carrying the weight that the Praetori's 3 channels distributed across an entire communicative architecture. She told him about her species, not the achievements, the failures. She described a world with a single moon and liquid water, and an atmosphere breathable without modification, an almost impossibly hospitable environment by Praetori standards. Sereth's homeworld, Kethros Prime, was a high-gravity body with an atmosphere thick with sulfur compounds, where survival required the dense musculature and armored hide that evolution had granted his species over millions of years. The Terran homeworld sounded, by comparison, like a nursery. And yet this nursery species had developed weapons that could kill from invisibility, had built ships that his sensors could not detect, had sent a diplomat who spoke his private language and a warship that knew where to strike for maximum catastrophic effect, and had not resolved the contradiction between the two before arriving at his border. The diplomat continued. She described something she called history, a term Sereth understood conceptually but processed differently. Praetori historical records were subsonic archives, encoded in biological frequency patterns that every Praetori could access through direct neural interface. History, for the Praetori, was felt. It was experienced as emotional resonance, the accumulated subsonics of ancestors who had broadcast their truth into a recording medium that preserved not just the facts but the feelings. Terran history, as the diplomat described it, was different. It was debated, interpreted, contested. Multiple contradictory accounts of the same events existed simultaneously, and different factions within the species used different accounts to justify different actions. History was not a settled frequency that all Terrans harmonized with. It was an argument that never ended. Wars fought between members of their own kind, not the Praetori pattern of ritualized dominance contests that established hierarchy through display and minimal violence. Wars of annihilation, wars where the objective was the destruction of the enemy rather than the establishment of order. Wars fought over ideology, over disagreements about how a society should organize itself. Disagreements so profound that members of the same species would choose to kill each other rather than coexist with a different answer. Sereth's subsonics produced what his cultural training designated shock, not the shock of combat, the cognitive shock of encountering a concept that had no equivalent in Praetori experience. The Praetori could not sustain ideological disagreement. Subsonic dissonance between disagreeing individuals produced physiological pain that drove them toward consensus automatically. A Praetori who disagreed fundamentally with its social group experienced the disagreement as a physical wound that healed only through resolution. These Terrans could disagree and coexist. They could disagree and function. They could contain within a single political entity, the conquered, she called it, factions that wanted opposite things, and continue operating as a civilization. You sent a diplomat and a warship to the same meeting, Sereth said, his diplomatic register carrying frequencies of bewilderment he could not suppress, and neither one represents the whole of your intent. Yes. Then what is your intent? The Terran was quiet for a span of time that Sereth's bridge chronometer would later record as 11 seconds. In Praetori interaction, 11 seconds of silence from a species with no subsonic register was a void, a gap where information should be and was not, where a Praetori would be broadcasting and a Terran produced nothing. The absence was more disorienting than anything she had said. When she spoke, her whistled tones carried something that his analytical training could not account for, and his body recognized anyway. Our intent is to find out whether we can talk to you. That is not the same as knowing what we want to say. We are here because we heard you. Because after 9 years of listening, we understood enough to know that you are real, and that you are intelligent, and that you are afraid of the same silence we are afraid of. And we came because we believed, not all of us, not unanimously, not without argument, that being afraid together might be better than being afraid alone. Every oscillation pattern in Sereth subsonic broadcast settled into stillness. The dissonance, the assessment, the confusion, all of it resolved into a single sustained tone, clear and low, like a harmonic that had been searching for its complementary frequency and found it. He would not understand that tone for years. He would eventually classify it, in the private terminology he developed for the frequencies this contact had generated, as first recognition, the sound a Praetori produced when the thing it had been waiting for arrived. The phrase that broke him was not dramatic. It was not a threat or a demand or a revelation of capability. It was 5 words in the diplomatic register, whistled with imperfect but intelligible tonal precision by a being from a world 400 light-years away. "You told me you were afraid." She said it as an answer to his question. What had she done that no other species had done? And the words passed through his command tongue filters, through his tactical assessment protocols, through 4,000 years of institutional conditioning, and struck the place beneath all of it where the subsonic register lived. She had heard the fear, not the fear of the moment, not the defensive anxiety that his crew was broadcasting in response to the invisible weapon, the other fear, the old one. The structural, load-bearing fear that ran beneath the ascendancy like a subsonic frequency too deep to hear, present in every officer Sereth had ever served with, in every communication his species had ever produced, in the void-directed anxiety that his culture classified as strategic vigilance, and his body classified as what it actually was. Loneliness. 4,000 years, 11 contacts, 11 species that had heard the command tongue and responded to the command tongue and deferred to the dominance display and signed agreements and departed. And not one, not a single one in 4 millennia, had heard what was underneath. Until a species with one voice and no subsonic register, and the ability to destroy warships from nothing had stood in a small amber-lit chamber, and said, "You are afraid of the same silence we are afraid of." Sereth felt something shift in the deep architecture of his cognition, not a change of opinion or a tactical reassessment, something more fundamental. The reconfiguration of a framework he had not known was a framework, because it had been the only one he had ever occupied. The model that said, "The Praetori are alone, and conquest is the mechanism by which loneliness is managed, and first contact is the ritual by which new subordinates are integrated, and the void at the edge of map space is a security concern rather than a wound." The model was cracking. Not because the Terran had attacked it, because she had named it, because naming the model was the thing that revealed it as a model rather than reality. And the moment it became visible as a construct rather than a fact, it became optional. 11 species, Sereth said, and his voice carried the simultaneous output of both registers, command tongue and diplomatic, guttural and whistled, authority and vulnerability layered together in a mode of speech so rare that his cultural archives contained fewer than 30 recorded instances in the Ascendancy's history. 11 contacts, all successful by every objective metric, trade agreements, non-aggression pacts, information exchange, and every single one hollow. Because they heard the command tongue and responded to the command tongue, and the thing we actually said, the thing we said on the channel we could not control, went unanswered. Until now. Until now. Until a species that sent a warship and a diplomat to the same meeting, and whose warship did the one thing no species has ever done, said no, and whose diplomat did the other thing no species has ever done. What did I do? You told me you were afraid. The Terran's eyes, those strange, steady, circular pupilled eyes that gave away nothing through dilation or contraction, did something that Sarath's cultural database had no entry for. They filled with fluid, not blood, not a defensive secretion. A clear fluid that gathered at the lower margins and did not fall, held in place by surface tension and whatever biological mechanism produced it. His analytical training offered no classification. His body offered one immediately: recognition. The subsonic frequency associated with encountering a being whose internal state matched your own. Pack resonance in the old terminology. The thing that happened when two hunters looked at each other across the steppe and understood without speaking that they were hunting the same prey. But there was no prey here. There was only the void, and the understanding that two species, separated by 400 light-years and several billion years of divergent evolution, were both afraid of the same darkness between the stars. Behind him, Vorath's subsonics had shifted. The fear was still there, a professional officer's reasonable anxiety in the presence of an undetectable weapon system, but layered over it now was something else: resonance. The harmonic pattern that Praetori produced when they recognized their own experience in another's broadcast. Vorath was hearing what Sarath was hearing, feeling what Sarath was feeling. The subsonic network of the bridge was synchronizing around the frequency their commander was producing. It was the mechanism that had held the ascendancy together for 4 millennia, automatic, involuntary, as reliable as gravity. When a signal was strong enough and clear enough, every Praetori within range oriented toward it like iron filings aligning with a magnetic field. Not through obedience or discipline, through physics, through the deep biological truth that a Praetori in subsonic alignment was healthier, calmer, and more functional than a Praetori in dissonance. The strongest signal on this bridge was telling 1,200 Praetori aboard the unyielding vow that the universe contained something their commander's body recognized as significant, and their institutional training had never prepared them for. And 1 deck below, and 2 decks below that, and in the engine rooms and the weapons bays and the crew quarters, officers and crew who had never heard the diplomatic register were feeling the resonance anyway, because the subsonic layer carried the emotional truth even when the linguistic content was absent. That was what Praetori biology did. It aligned. It found the strongest signal and harmonized with it, the way a hunting pack fell into the rhythm of its lead tracker. And the strongest signal on the bridge of the unyielding vow in this moment was not the tactical confusion or the defensive fear or the institutional conditioning that said first contacts followed a script. The strongest signal was the one Sarath had never produced in the presence of an alien species before. Hope, raw, unprocessed, involuntary hope, produced by a body that had spent 31 years pretending it did not know what it was waiting for, and had just, in the space of a single conversation, found out. Kale at sensors had stopped scanning. Drain at navigation had turned from his console to face the main display. Even Vorath, the most disciplined officer Sarath had ever served with, had loosened her grip on the weapons console and was watching the small Terran on the screen with an expression that Praetori facial musculature did not usually produce in tactical situations. Every one of them was listening, not to the words were in the diplomatic register, and only Sarath and the senior diplomatic staff had training in that mode. They were listening to the subsonics, to the frequencies that Sarath was producing in response to what the Terran was saying, to the involuntary broadcast of their High Commander encountering something that his body recognized as significant before his mind could classify it. And one by one, ship by ship, as the subsonic cascade propagated through the crescent of judgment, 12,000 Praetori were beginning to feel the same thing. The next 4 hours produced something Sarath had never participated in during 6 first contacts and 31 years of service. A conversation, not a negotiation, where one party held leverage and the other accommodated. Not a treaty discussion, where terms were established based on relative power. A conversation in the oldest sense, 2 minds moving through unfamiliar territory together, neither one certain of the ground, neither one unwilling to continue. They drafted what the Terran called an accord. She explained the word, one of 17 Terran words for an agreement reached through mutual adjustment, each carrying different connotations of sacrifice, benefit, and process. The Praetori language had no equivalent. Praetori agreement was driven by subsonic consensus, the biological imperative to resolve dissonance through conformity. A Praetori who disagreed with the group experienced physiological pain until alignment was achieved. Compromise, as a deliberate process, was unnecessary. You have 17 words for a process my species accomplishes without thinking, Sarath said. And you have a biological mechanism for a process my species has been trying to accomplish through language and law and institutional design for 10,000 years, and failing, and trying again, and failing differently, and building new institutions to address the failures of the old ones, and continuing. Sarath felt his subsonics produce wry acknowledgement, a rare frequency. Your species is exhausting. Yes, we are. The accord they produced was not a treaty. It was a mutual acknowledgement of incomprehension, a formal statement that said, we do not understand each other. We are not certain we can understand each other. But we agree that the attempt is worth making, and we commit to continuing the conversation. It was the most honest document Sarath had ever signed. It was also the most unsettling. Every previous agreement in his career had been built on certainty, known quantities, established hierarchies, measurable terms. This one was built on a shared admission of ignorance, and the shared decision that ignorance was a better foundation than pretense. During the drafting, the Terran explained the internal politics of her conquered, the 3 factions that had argued for 11 years about how to approach first contact. The Transparency Bloc, which wanted full disclosure of everything humanity possessed. The Caution Coalition, which wanted graduated revelation over decades. And the Deterrence faction, which wanted to arrive with a battle fleet. They argued for 11 years, Sarath said, and they sent both. They sent both because they could not agree. The meridian is the compromise, the vigil is the descent. Both exist in the same system because my species cannot resolve the contradiction between reaching out and protecting itself, and instead of resolving it, we carried it here. Both halves, simultaneously. Sarath's subsonics churned through patterns that would take him years to classify. He was encountering a form of social organization that violated every axiom of Praetori political theory. A government that contained its own opposition. A military that acted outside diplomatic authority. A species that sent its contradictions to first contact instead of resolving them first. And it had worked. Not in the way the Praetori's unified approach worked, clean, efficient, hierarchically ordained. It had worked the way a forest fire worked, messy, destructive, uncontrolled. And somehow, in the aftermath, producing conditions for growth that nothing planned could have achieved. The invisible warship had done the thing the Praetori's dominance display was designed to test. It had said no. It had responded to the corvettes with the only answer the Praetori military caste could not dismiss. And because it had said no, the diplomat's words, which would have been filtered through the lens of Praetori superiority if the corvettes had crossed unchallenged, landed on equal ground. The warship created the conditions. The diplomat created the meaning. Both simultaneously, neither one speaking for the whole species. The contradiction itself was the message. Sarath thought about the contested frontier campaign, the engagement that had earned him his current rank. 3 years of Praetori military operations against a border incursion by a species that had never been formally contacted, never been assessed, never been offered the crescent of judgment. They had simply appeared at the edge of ascendancy space and begun harvesting resources from systems the Praetori considered part of their defensive perimeter. The campaign had been clean, efficient, and decisive. Praetori doctrine applied with precision. The incursion neutralized, the border secured, the enemy driven back. 3 years, 7 engagements, casualties within acceptable parameters. And afterward, the silence. The same silence that followed every Praetori military success. The absence that sat in the space where something else should have been. He had told himself it was the weight of command, the solitary burden that came with sending crew into engagements where not everyone returned. He had told himself it was maturity, the recognition that victory carried costs that younger officers did not yet understand. He had not told himself the truth, because the truth was a subsonic frequency he had trained himself not to hear. That every Praetori military success, every dominance display, every border secured, every newcomer that deferred to the crescent, was another answer to a question the Praetori were not consciously asking. Is there anyone out there who can match us? And for 4,000 years, the answer had been no. And the no had felt like safety, and the safety had felt like strength, and the strength had felt like the architecture of a civilization doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Until a small Terran diplomat named the architecture for what it was, a fortress built not to keep enemies out, but to contain a loneliness that had nowhere else to go, and the fortress named became visible, and visible became a choice. The choice terrified him, not because it was wrong. His subsonics, the register that could not deceive, were telling him with absolute clarity that the fortress was real, and that living inside it had cost the Praetori something they could not afford to keep losing. The choice terrified him because accepting it meant that 31 years of service, 6 first contacts, and the institutional framework of the Ascendancy's entire diplomatic apparatus had been oriented around a lie so fundamental that it was invisible. Not a deliberate deception. The Praetori could not deliberately deceive themselves, not with the subsonic register broadcasting truth every moment of every day. A structural lie. A lie of architecture rather than intention. The lie that said, this is how the universe works and there is no other way. The Terran had shown him another way. Messy, contradictory, exhausting. A species that spent more energy arguing with itself than the Praetori spent on external diplomacy. A species that had 17 words for compromise, because it failed at agreement so frequently that it needed a specialized vocabulary for the failure modes. After the signing, Sarath did something he had never done in the presence of an alien species. Something no Praetori High Commander in the historical record had done during a first contact. He lowered his crest. The gesture was older than the Ascendancy itself, rooted in the pack-bonding rituals of the predatory ancestors, who had hunted the high-gravity steppes of their homeworld in coordinated groups where cooperation between hunters was the difference between eating and starving. Raising the crest was assertion. I am above you. Lowering it carried the only meaning in the Praetori physical vocabulary that had no military connotation. It meant I am not above you. In the oldest ceremonial register, the one that predated language, it meant we hunt the same darkness. Sarath lowered it knowing that every Praetori on his bridge was watching, knowing that his subsonics would carry the gesture's emotional resonance to every officer within range, knowing that by morning, the subsonic network of the fleet, 12,000 Praetori broadcasting continuously, would carry the frequency of what he had done to every ship in the formation. The Terran Kethara responded with a gesture of her own. She inclined her head. Small. No biological weight that Serath's systems could measure. No subsonic accompaniment. No involuntary broadcast. No register shift. Just a physical movement, chosen and performed by a being whose body offered no guarantee of the meaning behind it. And yet Serath understood it. Not through analysis. Not through the cultural database he had spent decades building. He understood it the way his ancestors had understood the lowered crest of a fellow hunter across the steppe, through the thing beneath language, beneath register, beneath biology. The thing that two minds did when they reached the same place at the same time and recognized each other there. The moment held, 3 seconds, 4, 5, neither moved. The display carried their images across 11,000 kilometers of void, and between those images, the debris of 93 lives expanded in its own slow trajectory. And in the gap where those lives had been, something was taking shape that neither Praetori protocol nor Terran democracy had designed. Not peace. Peace was a political condition requiring institutions that did not yet exist. Not alliance. Alliance implied shared objectives that had not been defined. Recognition. The thing the Praetori subsonic register produced when it encountered a matching frequency. The thing the Terran had produced through choice, through the deliberate, biologically unsupported decision to learn a language, hear a fear, name a loneliness, and reach across 400 light-years of void to say we are here. Serath thought about the 11 contacts, the Kelmari, the Orhani, the Thesic and the Veridani and the Gorath and all the others whose names his cultural archives preserved with meticulous institutional respect, and whose absence his subsonics still mourned in frequencies he had spent 3 decades pretending he did not hear. 11 species, 11 agreements, 11 silences dressed as success. And then the 12th, the one that sent a weapon and a voice, the one whose weapon said no and whose voice said you are not alone. The one that contained within itself the capacity for both the killing blow and the open hand, and chose between them moment by moment, without biological enforcement, without subsonic consensus, without any mechanism except the slow, imperfect, never-finished process of deciding what it wanted to be. After the channel closed, Serath sat on his bridge and listened to his fleet. The subsonics had changed, not dramatically, not the sharp shifts that accompanied combat alerts or formation changes. A gradual transformation, spreading from ship to ship, as the crew of the unyielding Vow broadcast their unfiltered response to what they had witnessed through their commander's open channel, and the crews of adjacent ships received those broadcasts and added their own frequencies, and the harmonic cascade propagated through 47 warships like a wave through deep water. Consonants, not the consonants of a pack that had completed a cooperative hunt, the standard pattern, associated with collective satisfaction after shared effort. Something deeper, something Serath's analytical framework had never encountered because no Praetori fleet in the historical record had produced it. 12,000 Praetori broadcasting the same frequency on a channel none of them could consciously control. 12,000 biological truth-tellers producing, simultaneously, the sound of a species that had found what it had been hunting for across 4,000 years of empty space and hollow contacts and ritualized dominance displays that tested every newcomer with the same unspoken question. Are you strong enough to stand beside us? The answer, for the first time, was yes. Not because the Terrans were stronger, though the invisible warship suggested capabilities that Serath's tactical mind was still processing, because they were the first species that had heard the question. Vorath approached his command chair with the careful deference of a subordinate who recognized that her commander had just done something without precedent. High Commander, the fleet's subsonic pattern, I have never heard it before. What does it mean? Serath listened. The consonants filled the bridge, the ship, the formation, a frequency below hearing that his body felt the way his ancestors had felt the rumble of the ground when the herd moved. Not threat, not territory, belonging. "It means the conversation is working," he said. He thought about what the Terran had shown him. Not the warship, though the warship mattered, and the tactical implications would occupy his planning staff for years. Not the diplomat, though she had done something that 6 first contacts and 4,000 years of institutional history had not prepared him to process. What she had shown him was the gap between the two. The warship and the diplomat, the fist and the open hand, the species that contained both and chose between them through effort and argument and all 17 of their words for compromise, because nothing in their biology made the choice automatic. The Praetori achieved consensus through pain. Disagreement hurt, so they resolved it. Their unity was enforced by their own nervous systems. The Terrans achieved consensus through choice. Disagreement was tolerable, so resolution was voluntary. Their unity, when they achieved it, was the product of deliberate decision, repeated daily, sustained through institutions built to contain the argument rather than end it. And the Terran diplomat had done something with her single, unguaranteed voice that Serath's 3 registers and involuntary broadcasting had never accomplished in 6 first contacts. She had said, "I hear your fear," and her words had carried the weight of truth without any biological mechanism to enforce it. That was what made the 12th contact different from the first 11, not the invisible warship, not the technological superiority. The fact that a species with no subsonic register, a species that could lie on every channel it possessed, had chosen not to. Had chosen, freely without compulsion, to produce honesty through will alone. The Praetori broadcast truth because they could not help it. The Terrans offered truth because they chose to. And the choice, that fragile, biologically unsupported, exhausting, species-wide daily choice to reach toward honesty when deception was always available, was the thing the Praetori had been waiting 4,000 years to encounter. Not because it was better than their way, because it was proof that honesty could exist without being automatic, that the thing their biology compelled could also be freely given. Serath sat in his command chair on the bridge of the unyielding vow, and listened to 12,000 of his people singing below the threshold of hearing, their biology producing the sound of recognition that their minds were still processing. And he thought about the debris field expanding between his fleet and the small, unarmed frigate, and about the invisible warship that might or might not be watching from the void, and about the small being who had spoken his private language and named his private fear and offered, on a single imperfect channel, the answer his species had been asking for since before it had the words to frame the question. Are we alone? No, you are not alone. You have not been alone since we started listening. Tomorrow the work would begin, the accord ratified, frameworks built, the invisible warship's existence requiring conversations that his military staff would find as destabilizing as the subsonic frequency currently spreading through his fleet. Decades of contact and misunderstanding and adjustment, and all 17 Terran words for compromise, exercised and re-exercised, until both species had developed the institutional capacity to hold a relationship that neither biology nor precedent had prepared them for. The void between the stars was still vast, still cold, still indifferent to the small, warm things that moved through it and built structures against the dark. But it was no longer silent. And the silence, the 4,000-year silence that the Praetori had fortified themselves against with warships and dominance displays, and the involuntary broadcast of a loneliness they could not name, had ended not with a weapon, though a weapon had spoken first, but with a voice. A single, imperfect, biologically unsupported voice, saying on one channel what the Praetori said on 3. On his private console, a transmission waited. Encrypted at a frequency his communications officer had flagged as anomalous. It had appeared on the unyielding Vow's receivers without any detectable origin point, as though the void itself had authored it. 3 sentences in Terran Standard, accompanied by a machine translation into the Praetori command tongue. High Commander Sereth. The vigil will hold position and maintain silence unless the envoy requests otherwise. What she builds, we protect. Sereth read it twice. The professional diction of a military officer reporting a tactical posture, stripped of justification or apology. The invisible warship, acknowledging its presence without revealing its position. Confirming that the weapon existed, that it was watching, and that its purpose, the purpose its crew had carried across 400 light-years of void, was the same as the diplomat's. What she builds, we protect. The warship and the diplomat, the closed fist and the open hand. A species that contained both, and chose between them through 17 words for compromise, and sent them both to the same meeting because it could not choose only one. And the inability to choose was not a weakness, but the mechanism by which a species without subsonic consensus held itself together. Sereth closed the message. He did not respond. There was nothing to say to the invisible warship that his subsonics were not already saying to every Praetori in the formation. The frequency of recognition, spreading ship to ship, broadcast by 12,000 bodies that could not lie, confirming what the Terran diplomat had claimed and what the Terran warship had demonstrated. The silence between the stars had ended. The reaching was enough.